Why do the British always judge each other based on their accents? The other day, a German girl asked me this question. She'd been travelling around Southeast Asia and she'd met a lot of British people. And she said, I noticed they always comment on each other's accents the moment they meet each other. They normally make a joke about where they're from. And in particular, they bring up the word posh. And she asked me, what does it mean to be posh? So I'm just going to dig into this a little bit in this video, because as somebody who's lived in 5 countries and has also been travelling around the world for much of the last few years, been surrounded by Brits and people from all over, and also lived in other culturally British influenced countries like Australia, it is a very, very British thing to immediately comment on somebody's accent in a way that can be perceived as judgmental, potentially at times hostile. Often it's done in a jokey way. British humour can be pretty provocative like that. Sometimes it is actual hostility disguised as humour. But the reason that the British do it is because it relates to class consciousness. In Britain, there is a very clear social class system. Well, actually, I wouldn't say it's clear. Like it's very complicated, but it's very deeply ingrained in the British mentality. It's something that all British people are aware of, and not a lot of British people aren't particularly good at actually articulating what it means, but it manifests itself in so many ways throughout their life. But the accent is the clearest giveaway of where somebody stands in the social class system. And traditionally, you will have working class people with regional accents, so an accent that is a clear marker of where they come from in the UK. For example, if they're a working class Geordie, Newcastle, they will have the Geordie accent. If they're working class and from Cornwall, they will have a West Country accent. They will have an accent that sounds a bit like a farmer, and they'll probably have 6 fingers and be an inbred because they're from Cornwall. But if they're middle class, like myself, they will have a more neutral accent or a completely neutral accent. Maybe there will be a little bit of regional influence based on where they're from. For example, if you meet middle class people from the north of England, there will be like a slightly northern twang to the received pronunciation. So I had a mosquito on me. Or if they're from the south, it will be a very southern accent. And the reason that the middle classes talk the way that they do with this more neutral accent is because middle class culture places a heavy emphasis on correct English, on proper English, whereas working class culture doesn't do that in the same way. In fact, a lot of working class regional dialects, it's incorrect English formally. So if we look at the plural tenses, like sometimes you'll hear in working class dialects, they will say things like them steps instead of those steps, or we was going to the shop instead of we were going to the shop. These kind of things. And it makes sense that it's that way because traditionally the middle classes have placed way more emphasis on education. That was the clear marker. The working classes had the culture of you don't need to stay in education, get a job sooner so that you can start making money and you can build up financial security. A lot of sociologists would traditionally say as well that working class culture had more of an immediate gratification response, whereas the middle classes had a delayed one, and education was part of that. Get educated so that in the long run it can benefit you. But actually you'll see now that a lot of working class, especially working class Gen Xers and later millennials, they will encourage their children to get educated because that's really what's being pushed in the UK as the way of progressing and bettering yourself. However, linguistically, there is still very much that clear difference in the way they talk. And simultaneously, there is a tendency for working class British culture to have an anti-intellectualism about it. And I'll give you an example of this. I went to a state school, right? So a school funded by the government, no fees, very mixed. I would say it's predominantly working class kids, but there were middle class kids there as well. There were some very privileged kids. There were some very underprivileged kids. And my own social groups have always been a mixture of middle and working class people, whether that be in school and at university. But there were very clear differences when I was around the parents of my friends. And one of my best mates growing up, they are working class and they come from Luton, a town just above London. And if I used words that were a higher level of vocabulary, they would always shoot me down for it. They used to say something that they would call the mayonnaise rule, aka if a word is longer than mayonnaise, if it has more letters than the word mayonnaise, don't use it. And another thing you'll see as a common example of this is when working class people meet middle classes, if middle class people are using more extensive vocabulary, they will call them out for using big words, as they will say it, which, as far as I'm concerned, is a form of anti-intellectualism, normally based on the fact that they don't understand what the other person is saying. And it's frustrating if you're speaking to somebody in your own language, but you don't know what they're saying. But then at the same time, you need to just grow up and ask, what does that word mean, so that you can understand it, right? But perhaps that is a very middle class way of looking at it. But these kind of things, they can make a big difference on the way that people are talking. And there's an element of control with it, social control that comes with it too. So if somebody from the working classes was to start speaking differently, there might be people in their group around them or their family pulling them back down as well and saying, essentially, don't get above yourself. Don't start speaking like the middle classes. Know your place, right? Know where you stand in the social class system, because a fundamental part of the British social class system is, like I said there, knowing your place. You have a specific position in the pecking order, and you don't want to get too big for your boots. It's an example of tall poppy syndrome through language. So in the working class communities, there might be that control. People will banter each other. They'll take the piss out of them. They might do it in a harsh way to them by saying, stop pretending to be something that you're not. You'll see a lot of working class people as well, when they move into the professional environment, they start to lose their accent, or they deliberately try to get rid of it because they feel that they need to do that to fit in with that environment, or it happens naturally. But also because some middle class people might judge them and belittle them for having a regional accent. They might think that they're stupid if they're speaking with incorrect English, if they're not speaking in a more professional and formal way. Now, that's in the environment, but when it comes to meeting, sorry, that's in the work environment, but when it comes to meeting people, why they make this judgment, sure, it's the way that it gives away what social class that person comes from, but why does that actually matter? Well, fundamentally, because the social class system, with it being a hierarchy and an order, there are differing degrees of privilege, and it is a sign of having different cultural values, very much a them and us mentality. And there is a tendency of a lot of British people to assume that if they meet someone from a different social class, that they are going to make a judgment of them. So working classes often have a tendency to assume that if they meet a middle class person, they're going to be looking down on them as an uncultured pleb. Whereas the middle classes have a tendency to assume that the working classes are going to judge them for being a private school posh kid, when they're not. They're just university educated. There is this judgment that flows across every way. And the middle classes are particularly insecure because they're stuck in the middle. They're not working class, but they're also not upper class, right? But then the working classes at the bottom, well, the underclass are below, but then the working classes at the bottom, they know that that's where they are at the base level, when you've got the others above them. So traditionally, again, they were the people that were the cannon fodder in the army, the people doing the factory work, the dirty work. So there is that feeling of inferiority at times as well, which can lead to a defensiveness and a hostility. But more often than not, if we actually look at this on a deeper level, it's going to be a reflection of the person as an individual, right? Social class is a construct, but there are plenty of middle class and working class people who don't make these judgments straight away, or they'll make the judgment in the sense that they recognise that that person comes from a social class, but they're not going to treat them differently as a result of it. They're still going to be nice to them. And it's a problem that a lot of people have on the individual level, and it's influenced by that social class existence, right? But at the core of it, these British people, they just need to learn to be based in who they are. Middle classes, stop pretending to be something that you're not. You don't have to dumb it down and try and pretend that you're working class, but also you don't have to justify yourself and be, oh no, I'm not posh, I swear I'm not posh, right? But then working classes also need to realise that not all middle class people are looking down and judging them, and that you can mix between groups, right? class consciousness is a barrier in a lot of ways, and it exists on both the individual level and the systemic level. But that is a general summary of the difference. That is why British people make these judgments based on accent. I'll see you in the next video.